Dearest listeners, there exists amongst the ton a peculiar blindness to worth, one far more devastating than any failure of physical sight, especially when that worth resides in a woman the world has declared finished. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of a woman society had dismissed as past her bloom, and a young Earl who possessed the rare wisdom to recognize that life's greatest treasures often require the patience of time to fully ripen. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. In the spring of 1816, Mrs. Cordelia Fairfax resided in quiet obscurity at Willowmere, the Berkshire estate of her elder brother, Sir Edmund Fairfax. To the neighboring families, she represented that most pitiable of creatures, a childless widow of 38 years, relegated to dependence upon familial charity after 5 years of marriage, to a man who had viewed her principally as an ornamental addition to his collection of fine objects. The late Mr. Thaddeus Fairfax, no relation to her brother despite the shared surname, had been a wealthy gentleman of 60 years when he wed Cordelia at 23. Their union, arranged by her late father to settle substantial debts, had been as cold and formal as a business contract, which in truth it had been. Cordelia had learned the precise dimensions of her cage in the first month of marriage. During a dinner with neighboring gentry, she had offered an observation about the promising new crop rotation methods being discussed in agricultural journals. The conversation had continued around her as though she had not spoken, but later in their chambers, Mr. Fairfax had delivered his instruction with chilling civility. Wives who displayed unseemly learning embarrassed their husbands. The following 2 days passed in a silence so glacial that servants whispered and hurried past. That frost taught her more about her position than any words could have conveyed. For 5 interminable years afterward, she existed as a lovely ghost in his Gloucestershire manor, speaking only when addressed, smiling decorously, and slowly suffocating beneath the weight of enforced silence. His death, though she would never speak such sentiments aloud, had arrived as a mercy. The reading of his will, however, had delivered a final cruelty. The entirety of his fortune passed to a distant nephew, leaving Cordelia with a modest widow's portion that provided independence in theory, but poverty in practice. Her brother Edmund, a baronet of comfortable means and genuine kindness, had immediately offered her sanctuary at Willowmere. There, away from the pitying glances and whispered speculation of society, Cordelia had begun the slow process of recovering herself. She discovered that the silence she had been forced to maintain in marriage had taught her the value of observation. She noticed things others overlooked, the patterns of crop rotation that the estate's elderly steward followed by habit rather than reason, the medicinal properties of herbs growing wild in untended gardens, the small inefficiencies that accumulated into significant losses over the course of a year. With Edmund's bemused permission, she had begun implementing changes. Nothing dramatic at first, merely suggesting different planting schedules, recommending the cultivation of particular herb gardens that might provide both medicinal supplies for the estate workers and modest income from sales to local apothecaries. She studied agricultural treatises with the same intensity other ladies devoted to novels, corresponded with progressive farmers who were experimenting with new methods, and kept meticulous records of every innovation and its results. 3 years after taking up residence at Willowmere, the estate's yields had increased by nearly 40%. The tenant farmers, initially suspicious of a woman's interference in masculine domains, had become her most ardent supporters. She had taught them crop rotation methods that renewed exhausted soil, helped them establish small kitchen gardens that improved their family's nutrition, and advocated tirelessly with Edmund for repairs to their cottages and reduction of rents during poor harvest years. The local gentry, while congratulating Edmund on his improved fortunes, seemed incapable of crediting the true architect of this transformation. A woman, particularly one of mature years, could not possibly possess such capabilities. Surely it was Edmund's wise management, with perhaps some minor assistance from his widowed sister in the decorative aspects of the gardens. Cordelia found she did not particularly care whether she received recognition. The work itself provided satisfaction enough. In the soil and the seeds, in the careful observation of seasons and weather patterns, in the practical application of knowledge to improve lives, she had discovered something her marriage had nearly destroyed: purpose. She was no longer an ornament to be admired or a vessel to be filled with another's will. She was, in her own quiet way, essential. The society that had once formed the center of her youthful existence now seemed impossibly distant and rather ridiculous. The marriage mart with its desperate mothers and calculating fortune hunters, the endless rounds of balls where worth was measured in dowry and connections rather than character or capability, the suffocating rules that governed every interaction between men and women, all of it struck her as an elaborate game played by people who had forgotten there might be more meaningful pursuits. She attended local assemblies when Edmund insisted, danced when propriety demanded, and returned to her gardens and her record books with profound relief. At 38, Cordelia had made peace with the likelihood that she would never marry again. What gentleman would desire a wife past her childbearing years without fortune or exceptional beauty to recommend her? More importantly, what marriage could possibly offer her more freedom than she currently enjoyed? Better to remain Mrs. Fairfax, useful sister and innovative estate manager, than to risk another union that would demand her silence and submission. She did not think of herself as unhappy. Indeed, she considered herself remarkably fortunate compared to many women of her station. She had a comfortable home, meaningful work, and a brother who valued her contributions even if he could not quite articulate their full extent. If sometimes, in the evening quiet, she felt the absence of a true companion, someone who might appreciate not merely her competent management, but the thoughts behind it, the joy she found in watching tenant families thrive, the satisfaction of solving complex agricultural problems. Well, such yearnings were the price of wisdom. She had learned that true partnership between man and woman was rarer than the tons romantic poets suggested. Better to be contentedly alone than miserably married. It was this woman, capable, resigned, and quite certain that life's great adventures had passed her by, who stood in her medicinal garden one bright May morning, utterly unaware that fate was about to deliver a challenge to every assumption she had made about her future. The young gentleman who arrived at Willowmere on that fateful morning came not as a suitor or a social caller, but as a desperate student. Adrian Hartwell, recently and unexpectedly elevated to Earl of Lyndhurst upon his father's sudden death, had inherited an enormous responsibility for which his 27 years and classical education had left him woefully unprepared. The late Earl had been a man of the old school, more concerned with maintaining ancestral dignity than with the practical management of the 7 estates that supported the title. When an apoplexy claimed him during what should have been a routine hunt, his heir had returned from Cambridge to discover properties in various states of disrepair, tenants struggling with outdated farming methods, and a steward who seemed to believe that change was a form of treason against tradition. As Adrian rode toward Willowmere that May morning, his thoughts did not dwell on agricultural philosophy or enlightened management theory. They circled obsessively around the very real threat of creditors, the mounting debts his father had ignored, and the stark reality that without dramatic improvement in estate revenues within 2 years, the Lyndhurst legacy would crumble in his inexperienced hands. This visit to Sir Edmund Fairfax was not academic curiosity. It was the last desperate grasp of a drowning man reaching for solid ground. Adrian possessed the intelligence to recognize his own ignorance and the humility to seek guidance. While reviewing his estate's accounts with growing alarm, he had noticed a peculiar pattern. The properties surrounding Willowmere in Berkshire had prospered over the past 3 years, while his own nearby holdings stagnated. Discreet inquiries revealed that Sir Edmund Fairfax had achieved this remarkable transformation not through increased rents or harsh treatment of tenants, but through agricultural innovations that had somehow doubled productivity while actually reducing the physical burden on the workers. When Adrian called upon Sir Edmund to request permission to observe these methods, he had anticipated meeting an innovative gentleman farmer, perhaps influenced by the progressive agricultural societies that were gaining prominence among forward-thinking members of the gentry. He had not anticipated being directed to the herb garden, where he would find not Sir Edmund but his widowed sister, secateurs in hand, calmly pruning chamomile while discussing crop rotation schedules with the head gardener. Mrs. Cordelia Fairfax, when she straightened to acknowledge the introduction, presented a figure that immediately challenged Adrian's expectations. She was not young. He estimated her age at somewhere past 35. But she possessed a quality that had nothing to do with youthful bloom and everything to do with presence. Her dark hair, simply arranged, showed threads of silver at the temples that she had made no attempt to disguise. Her hands, ungloved for garden work, showed the capable strength of someone who did not merely direct labor, but participated in it. Her eyes, a remarkable gray-green like storm clouds over summer fields, regarded him with the calm assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating situations rather than seeking approval from observers. She was, Adrian realized with some surprise, not conventionally beautiful in the way the marriage mart defined such things. Her features were too strong, her bearing too direct, her entire demeanor far too self-possessed for a society that preferred women to be decoratively uncertain. Yet there was something compelling about her, an intelligence in her gaze, a competence in her movements, a quiet authority that suggested someone who had long ago stopped caring whether others found her pleasing. Edmund Fairfax, with the cheerful obliviousness of a man who genuinely respected his sister but could not quite perceive how unusual that respect was, had explained that Cordelia was the true architect of Willowmere's transformation. If Lord Lyndhurst wished to learn her methods, Edmund would be delighted to facilitate the arrangement, though he rather thought Cordelia might have opinions on the matter herself. Cordelia had regarded Adrian with frank appraisal, clearly weighing whether this young peer was genuinely interested in agricultural innovation or merely seeking to patronize country eccentrics for his own amusement. Whatever she read in his expression, perhaps the combination of earnestness and barely concealed desperation that accompanies a man drowning in responsibilities he does not understand, seemed to satisfy her. She had agreed, with certain conditions. He would not simply observe, he would work. He would listen to her explanations rather than dismissing them as women's fancies. And he would never, under any circumstances, attempt to implement her methods without fully understanding the reasoning behind them, for half-understood knowledge was more dangerous than admitted ignorance. Adrian, somewhat dazed by both the unexpected source of wisdom and the directness of its delivery, had agreed to all terms. Thus began an association that would prove far more significant than either party anticipated. Their lessons began in the fields at dawn, for as Cordelia informed him with matter-of-fact practicality, crops did not recognize aristocratic preference for late rising. Adrian, who had imagined agricultural instruction as a series of theoretical discussions in comfortable libraries, found himself instead walking the estate boundaries in the early morning light, learning to read the land itself. Cordelia taught him to evaluate soil by its color and texture, to identify which fields had been depleted by years of single-crop cultivation, to recognize the subtle signs that indicated proper drainage or problematic water pooling. She explained crop rotation not as an abstract concept from agricultural treatises, but as a practical restoration of the earth's vitality. Legumes fixed nitrogen in the soil, replenishing what grains depleted. Root vegetables broke up compacted earth, allowing air and water to penetrate depths that shallow-rooted plants could never reach. Fallow periods were not wasted time, but essential recovery, like the sleep a body required between days of labor. The land, she observed, was not an inexhaustible resource to be exploited, but a living system to be partnered with. And a farmer who understood this distinction would prosper while his neighbors slowly destroyed their own inheritance. When Adrian asked for the third time that week whether planting wheat in the same field again would truly deplete the soil if fertilizer was added, Cordelia felt the accumulated frustration of years defending her knowledge against presumptuous ignorance surface unbidden. "No, my lord," she said, her voice acquiring an uncharacteristic edge. "As I explained on Tuesday, and again on Thursday, the soil would be exhausted regardless. Fertilizer is not resurrection, it is merely temporary sustenance. The sharpness in her tone startled them both. She paused, pressing her lips together, then added more gently, "Forgive me. The repetition makes me impatient. I forget that what took me years to learn cannot be absorbed in mere weeks." Adrian, rather than taking offense, found himself oddly reassured by this glimpse behind her competent facade. "Please do not apologize," he said quietly. "I have been asking the same question because I struggle to trust something that contradicts everything my father's steward taught me. Your impatience is earned, and your honesty is preferable to false courtesy." The moment passed, but something had shifted. He had seen not merely the infallible estate manager, but the woman herself, with human limits to her patience and visible scars from battles fought to have her knowledge respected. Adrian, whose Cambridge education had been heavy on classical languages and light on practical applications, found himself fascinated not merely by the information, but by the mind that synthesized it. Cordelia did not simply repeat received wisdom from agricultural manuals. She questioned, experimented, and refined. She kept detailed records of every innovation, tracking not just yields but variables, weather patterns, soil conditions, timing of planting and harvest. She corresponded with progressive farmers throughout England and even abroad, sharing discoveries and learning from others' experiments. She approached agriculture with the rigor of a natural philosopher, yet never lost sight of the human element. The families whose survival depended upon successful harvests, the children whose futures rested on their parents' prosperity. As spring progressed into early summer, their lessons expanded beyond the fields. Cordelia showed him the medicinal gardens she had established, explaining which herbs treated common ailments among the workers and how cultivation of these plants had reduced both suffering and the estate's expenses for doctors and medicines. She introduced him to tenant families, teaching him to truly see them not as interchangeable laborers, but as individuals with distinct capabilities and circumstances. Some were natural innovators, eager to try new methods. Others required careful convincing backed by visible results. Some families needed temporary rent reductions to weather difficulties. Others benefited more from assistance with repairs or tools. The key was observation and adaptation rather than rigid policy applied uniformly without regard for circumstances. In the estate office, surrounded by her meticulous ledgers and crop reports, Cordelia revealed the economic philosophy underlying her methods. Increased productivity meant nothing if it came at the cost of depleted soil or exhausted workers. Sustainable prosperity required thinking in terms of decades rather than single seasons, maintaining the health of both land and people so that future generations might inherit a thriving estate rather than a depleted husk. The short-sighted extraction of maximum profit in the present merely ensured poverty in the future. Adrian found himself arriving earlier each morning and departing later each evening. What had begun as desperate necessity, learn quickly or fail spectacularly, evolved into genuine fascination. Here was a realm of knowledge entirely absent from his classical education, yet it struck him as fundamentally more important than perfect Latin declensions or the finer points of Greek rhetoric. This knowledge fed people, sustained communities, and shaped the landscape itself. Moreover, it was knowledge delivered by a teacher whose combination of competence, patience, and uncompromising standards earned his profound respect. He began to notice other things about Cordelia Fairfax beyond her agricultural expertise. The way she listened to tenant concerns with complete attention, never dismissing problems as trivial or solutions as impossible until she had considered them fully. The dry wit that occasionally surfaced in her observations, suggesting a woman who saw society's absurdities clearly but had learned to comment on them obliquely rather than directly. The passion that animated her features when discussing successful harvests or improved tenant housing, revealing someone who found genuine joy in others' prosperity rather than viewing estate management as mere obligation or business transaction. He noticed, too, the way she occupied space at social gatherings, standing among the matrons and chaperones, her bearing comfortable, but her expression slightly distant, as though her thoughts ranged elsewhere even while her body remained properly present. At the local assembly Edmund convinced them to attend. Younger ladies fluttered and preened, seeking advantageous notice. Older women managed strategic introductions and calculated connections. Cordelia simply existed, apparently untouched by the social calculations swirling around her, neither seeking attention nor seeming distressed by its absence. When he requested her hand for a dance, a country dance, nothing so intimate as a waltz, but an invitation nonetheless, he observed the ripple of surprise through the assembly. Mrs. Fairfax dancing with the young Earl of Lyndhurst? How unusual! How charitable of him to notice poor Edmund's widowed sister. The unspoken assumption, clear in every raised eyebrow and whispered comment, was that his invitation represented kindness rather than desire, duty rather than preference. The assembly room pressed close around them. The cacophony of forced laughter and eager speculation, the suffocating blend of heavy perfumes and melting candle wax, the overheated air thick with social performance. Amid this clamor, Cordelia moved through the dance figures with a quietness that felt like sanctuary, her presence focused and real in a room full of carefully constructed facades. Cordelia herself seemed to share the company's assumption. She accepted gracefully, neither pleased nor displeased, as though his invitation were simply another social obligation to be discharged with appropriate decorum. As they moved through the figures of the dance, Adrian found himself frustrated by the impossibility of real conversation amidst the music and movement. For the first time, they touched hands without the excuse of examining soil or reviewing ledgers, yet they spoke only of weather and music. Precisely the sort of meaningless pleasantries that made up every other conversation in this room. The contrast between what he wished to say and what propriety permitted felt almost physically painful. He wanted to tell her that he had begun implementing her crop rotation methods on one of his smaller estates, that early results suggested remarkable improvement, that he had convinced his steward to trial her recommendations despite the man's considerable skepticism. He wanted to discuss the treatise on soil management she had lent him, to debate her theories about woodland conservation and sustainable timber harvesting, to hear her thoughts on a dozen agricultural innovations he had been reading about. Instead, they exchanged pleasantries about the weather and the music, performed their steps with proper form, and parted when the dance concluded with nothing more meaningful accomplished than the observation of social niceties. As their hands separated for the final time and he bowed, escorting her back to her place among the matrons, Adrian experienced an unexpected revelation. This was the first time they had been together without speaking of the land, and yet he had felt more connected to her than to anyone else in that crowded, noisy room. The realization unsettled him considerably. He found that the evening had lost considerable appeal once she was no longer his partner. What value had these conversations, speculation about who might marry whom, discussion of London fashions and continental travel, the endless recycling of on dit and gossip? Trivial, all of it, compared to the discussions he had been having with Cordelia about crop yields and tenant welfare. These people inhabited the world's surface, concerned with appearances and social standing. She understood deeper currents, the forces that actually shaped lives and determined fates. As the weeks progressed, a truth he had been slow to recognize grew impossible to ignore. His interest in Cordelia Fairfax extended well beyond agricultural education. He admired her mind, certainly, but also the character revealed through her choices and actions. She had survived a stifling marriage and emerged not bitter but wiser, had faced social dismissal and responded by creating genuine worth rather than demanding recognition, had discovered purpose in service to others rather than self-advancement. In a society that measured value in entirely superficial terms, she represented something far more substantial. Moreover, he found himself thinking of her at odd moments, wondering what she would make of a particular problem he encountered, imagining her reaction to some innovation he had read about, wishing he might discuss with her some observation or insight that struck him during his increasingly competent management of his estates. Her perspective had become, without his quite realizing when or how, essential to his own thinking. What had developed was not the sudden overwhelming passion celebrated in romantic poetry, but something quieter, deeper, and possibly more dangerous, precisely because it crept upon him gradually rather than announcing itself dramatically. The difficulty was that, having discovered what conversation with a truly compatible mind felt like, having experienced the satisfaction of partnership between intellectual equals, having glimpsed what marriage might be when founded on mutual respect rather than social calculation, after discovering all this, the prospect of a conventional suitable marriage became utterly intolerable. Where was the sense in turning away from genuine compatibility to pursue hollow convention? The question became not whether he wished to court Cordelia Fairfax, but whether he could find a way to convince her that their disparity in years represented not an insurmountable obstacle, but rather a difference that rendered them complementary rather than incompatible. He began visiting Willowmere not merely for instruction but socially, bringing books he thought might interest her. Not romantic novels, but treatises on political economy and agricultural innovation. He sought her opinions on estate management decisions that required no external guidance, simply because he genuinely valued her perspective. He found excuses to extend his stays, joining the family for dinner and prolonging the evening with conversation that ranged far beyond farming, touching on politics and philosophy, literature and natural science, revealing the breadth of Cordelia's learning and the acuity of her intellect. Edmund, observing these developments with bemused approval, seemed to consider it merely a friendship between intellectual kindred spirits. Society, with its limited imagination, drew very different conclusions. The misunderstanding, when it took root, grew with the invasive persistence of the worst garden weeds, spreading rapidly through the poisoned soil of social assumption and prejudiced expectation. Its seeds were planted when Edmund's niece, Miss Arabella Fairfax, arrived at Willowmere for the summer. Arabella, the daughter of Edmund's younger brother who had emigrated to Jamaica 2 decades prior, had been sent to England for her first London season. At 19 years of age, with a comfortable fortune from her father's successful plantation ventures and the fresh beauty of youth unshadowed by experience, she represented everything society expected in a prospective bride for a young Earl. Her uncle Edmund had agreed to sponsor her introduction to the ton, and she was spending the late spring at Willowmere before the family removed to London for the season proper. She was, Cordelia observed with affectionate amusement, exactly the sort of young lady she herself had once been. Hopeful, somewhat naive, eager to please, and entirely convinced that marriage represented life's ultimate achievement. The girl possessed a sweet disposition, moderate accomplishments in the expected areas of drawing and music, and absolutely no interest whatsoever in agriculture, estate management, or any of the pursuits that consumed Cordelia's attention. She did, however, possess considerable enthusiasm for the social activities Cordelia had largely abandoned, and she viewed her sophisticated widowed aunt as both chaperone and guide to navigating the complex waters of society. When Lord Lyndhurst continued his regular visits to Willowmere after Arabella's arrival, the neighborhood's assumptions followed a depressingly predictable path. A wealthy young earl visiting a household containing an eligible young lady of appropriate age and fortune could mean only one thing: courtship. That he spent most of his time in discussion with the aunt rather than flirtation with the niece was easily explained. Mrs. Fairfax, as the girl's chaperone, naturally participated in social calls. That the Earl seemed to enjoy these chaperoned visits suggested proper deference to propriety rather than any inappropriate interest in the chaperone herself. Cordelia, painfully aware of the gossip circulating through every drawing room in the district, felt the bitter irony of the situation. After years of being overlooked and dismissed, she had finally found someone who seemed to genuinely value her thoughts and seek her company. And society, utterly incapable of imagining that such regard might be based on anything other than avuncular kindness or dutiful courtesy, had decided to use her presence as evidence of entirely conventional romantic interest in her niece. She told herself it was foolish to feel disappointment. What had she expected? That a man of 7 and 20, in possession of a significant title and substantial fortune, might genuinely prefer the company of a woman of 8 and 30 with neither youth nor wealth to recommend her? That the hours he spent discussing agricultural reform and estate management somehow constituted courtship rather than professional consultation? That his evident enjoyment of her conversation represented romantic interest rather than intellectual curiosity? Such hopes belonged to naive girls, not to women who had learned life's harder lessons. She understood the danger of misinterpreting male attention as something it was not. The afternoon she stood at the drawing-room window watching Lord Lyndhurst and Arabella laughing together in the garden below, she felt not jealousy, but something far more insidious, the phantom echo of her own courtship. Thaddeus Fairfax had paid her such attentions once, bringing her books, seeking her opinions on estate matters, seeming to value her thoughts. Those courtship performances had evaporated within weeks of the wedding, revealing themselves as merely the careful inspection of a collector before purchase. She would not survive such a deception a second time. The first had nearly destroyed her. Another would finish the work. Thaddeus Fairfax had seemed to value her opinions during their brief courtship. Or rather, she had convinced herself he valued them because she desperately wanted to believe the marriage might be more than a business arrangement. She had learned, through 5 years of suffocating disappointment, not to mistake politeness for genuine regard or temporary interest for lasting commitment. Lord Lyndhurst, she concluded, was simply a conscientious young man seeking to make informed decisions about his responsibilities. His interest was professional, not personal, valuing her knowledge while remaining blind to her person, seeking her expertise while courting Arabella. That he continued to visit Willowmere after Arabella's arrival surely indicated where his true interest lay, with the appropriate young lady rather than her inconveniently present chaperone. She began, therefore, to carefully withdraw. Not dramatically, for that would be as foolish as her earlier hopes, but gradually and naturally. She arranged her days to be occupied in the far fields or in tenant visits when she knew he was likely to call. She ensured that Arabella took precedence in conversations when they did meet, gently redirecting topics to areas that might interest a young lady of Arabella's tastes, rather than indulging in the intellectual discussions she had so enjoyed. She maintained pleasant courtesy while systematically dismantling the unusual intimacy that had developed between them. If Adrian seemed confused by this withdrawal, even hurt, Cordelia told herself she was doing him a service. He was young enough to have not yet learned the cruelty of social distinctions, to imagine that intellectual compatibility might overcome differences of age and circumstance. Better that she teach him now, through gentle withdrawal, that such fancies were impractical. He would thank her for it eventually, when he made a suitable match with Arabella or some other appropriate young lady, when he looked back on this period as a pleasant friendship, rather than an embarrassing misunderstanding of propriety and possibility. She did not acknowledge even to herself how much the withdrawal cost her, how she missed their early morning discussions in the fields, the way he listened to her explanations with complete attention, and asked questions that revealed genuine understanding rather than polite pretense. How she had come to anticipate his visits with an eagerness that had nothing to do with professional consultation and everything to do with the simple joy of his company. How she had begun to feel in his presence, not like the pitiable widow society dismissed, but like someone whose thoughts and opinions held genuine value. How, for the first time in years, she had glimpsed the possibility of partnership based on mutual respect, intellectual equality, and genuine affection rather than duty or expedience. But such acknowledgments served no purpose beyond self-torture. She had learned long ago that women of her age and circumstances could not afford the luxury of romantic hope. Far better to focus on reality, her work, her gardens, her genuine satisfaction in tangible accomplishments rather than impossible dreams. Adrian, for his part, found Cordelia's withdrawal both inexplicable and profoundly distressing. He had been working himself toward a declaration, carefully planning how he might approach not merely her, but also her brother, how he might make clear that his interest was neither casual nor based on any misunderstanding of their circumstances. He had been composing arguments to counter what he assumed would be her reasonable objections: their difference in age, her lack of fortune, society's inevitable censure. He had been prepared to demonstrate that none of these obstacles represented genuine impediments to a marriage based on mutual respect and genuine affection. What he had not anticipated was that she would systematically remove herself from his presence before he could make any such declaration. Her absence at times, when previously she would have been available, struck him as deliberate. Her redirection of conversations to include Arabella seemed calculated to prevent the private discussions they had previously enjoyed. Even her physical positioning changed. She now ensured that rooms contained other occupants, that their paths crossed only in circumstances that precluded any intimate conversation. The neighborhood's assumptions about his intentions toward Arabella only complicated matters further. Every visit to Willowmere was interpreted as courtship of the niece rather than attempted connection with the aunt. Every book he brought for Cordelia was seen as proof of his learned nature, making him an even more suitable match for young Arabella. Every attempt to engage Cordelia in conversation was viewed as proper attention to the girl's chaperone and aunt. He attempted to clarify matters, to find opportunities to speak with Cordelia privately, to make his actual intentions clear. But she seemed to anticipate and prevent every such attempt with a skill that suggested extensive practice in avoiding unwanted attention, which, he realized with growing frustration, she had probably developed during her previous marriage and the years since. Learning to discourage advances from men whose interest in her person masked more exploitative intentions. How could he make her understand that his interest was neither exploitative nor temporary, that he valued not merely her knowledge but her character, not merely her competent management, but the woman herself? How could he convince her that their age difference represented not an obstacle but an advantage, that he desired not a decorative young wife but a true partner who could challenge and improve him? How could he prove that his regard was neither pity nor passing fascination, but genuine and enduring? The answer, he began to realize, required something more substantial than mere words. Cordelia Fairfax was a woman who believed in actions and evidence over pretty declarations. She had been lied to before, trapped by empty promises into a marriage that had wasted 5 years of her life. She would not risk such disappointment again without proof that this time was different. The question became, what proof could he offer that would be sufficiently convincing? The solution, when it came to him, had the rightness of inevitability. Cordelia valued practical accomplishment over romantic gesture, respected capability over sentiment, believed in systematic change over individual kindness. Very well then. He would meet her in the language she understood best, through action that reflected her values and elevated her work beyond the obscurity in which society's blindness had hidden it. 3 intensive weeks of travel followed his withdrawal from Willowmere. He appeared to accept the general assumption that courtship with young Arabella was proceeding along proper, formal channels. In truth, he traveled to every estate where Cordelia's methods had been implemented, documenting results with the same meticulous attention to detail she had taught him. He interviewed tenants, examined crops, reviewed ledgers, and compiled extensive evidence of how her innovations had transformed struggling properties into thriving communities. But the data collection represented only the first phase of his plan. Adrian had learned enough during his time at Cambridge and possessed sufficient connections among reform-minded peers to understand how genuine change occurred. It was not enough to simply admire innovation. One must create the structural changes that allowed innovation to spread. Cordelia's methods could transform agriculture throughout England, but only if the legal and social barriers preventing women from holding positions of authority and receiving credit for their work were systematically dismantled. What he planned required careful strategy, political alliances, and considerable personal risk. But then, love worth having had always required sacrifice, and he was prepared to offer far more than pretty words and romantic gestures. He would offer her not merely his heart, but his position, his influence, and his unstinting effort to create a world where women like Cordelia Fairfax could receive the recognition their achievements deserved. The June morning when Adrian's letter arrived at Willowmere began with Cordelia supervising the harvest of chamomile and lavender from the medicinal gardens. The work was pleasant, the weather fine, and she was managing to maintain the careful equanimity she had cultivated since accepting that the Earl of Lyndhurst's interest lay elsewhere. She had not forgotten him. That would have required an amputation of memory impossible to achieve. But she had successfully relegated their association to the category of pleasant interlude rather than harbinger of impossible possibilities. Therefore, when Edmund's footman delivered the thick packet bearing the Earl of Lyndhurst's seal, she opened it without particular expectation or dread, assuming it contained questions about some agricultural matter or perhaps a note of thanks for her previous assistance. What she found instead rendered her temporarily incapable of rational thought. The first document was a legal instrument, complex and official, bearing the signatures of multiple solicitors and witnesses. It appointed Mrs. Cordelia Fairfax as managing trustee of the Lyndhurst estates in Berkshire, Hampshire, and Somerset, with full authority over agricultural decisions, tenant relations, and estate improvements. The position carried a substantial salary, more than many stewards earned, enough to guarantee financial independence for life, and was designated as permanent, revocable only by Mrs. Fairfax herself or in the event of her death. This alone was unprecedented. Women did not hold positions of such authority. They might advise male relatives informally, might manage small properties during widowhood, but they did not receive formal appointments as estate managers with legal authority to make binding decisions. The document effectively made her one of the most powerful women in English agriculture, with control over thousands of acres and hundreds of tenant families. But it was the second document that destroyed the careful defenses she had constructed around her heart. It was not a brief note, but a lengthy letter in Adrian's own hand, documenting his 3-week journey through the estates she had transformed. He described conversations with tenants who spoke of her with something approaching reverence, families whose children were healthier because of her medicinal gardens, and whose futures were brighter because of her agricultural innovations. He detailed increased yields, improved soil quality, reduced mortality among livestock, enhanced prosperity that rippled through entire communities. But he had not stopped with documentation. He explained, in careful detail, his plan to present this evidence to the Corn Laws Committee and the Board of Agriculture. He intended to argue that agricultural innovation in England was being held back not by lack of knowledge, but by social prejudices that prevented the most capable individuals from being recognized and empowered regardless of gender. He had already secured support from several prominent reformers in the Lords who agreed that merit should supersede social convention in matters of practical importance. The letter's tone was not romantic in any conventional sense. There were no flowery declarations, no poetic comparisons, no effusive sentiments. Instead, there was respect manifested through action, regard demonstrated through genuine effort to elevate her work beyond the obscurity society had imposed. He wrote as one professional to another, one mind to another, one person who understood the satisfactions of meaningful work to another who shared that understanding. It was only in the final paragraphs that the letter shifted register, becoming something more personal and therefore more devastating in its impact. He wrote that he had spent 3 weeks seeking to understand what had caused her withdrawal from their previous friendship, and he believed he had determined the reason. Society had convinced her that his interest lay with her niece, and she, being too wise and too scarred by previous experience to risk hope where none existed, had withdrawn to prevent both embarrassment and pain. But society, as usual, was profoundly wrong. He did not love her, he wrote, despite her age and circumstances. He loved her precisely because of what her experiences had made her. Wise where youth would be naive, competent where privilege bred carelessness, authentic where society demanded performance. He had been raised to be an earl, trained in the expectations and behaviors appropriate to his rank. But she had taught him something far more valuable than aristocratic polish. That true leadership came not from inherited position, but from character forged through adversity. That worth was not measured by social standing, but by what one created and built. That partnership meant not possession or protection, but collaboration between equals. He concluded by acknowledging that he could not erase their difference in years or change society's prejudices overnight. But he could, and would, spend his life working to create a world where her capabilities received proper recognition, where women of talent and determination could achieve positions worthy of their abilities. Whether or not she chose to accept his personal regard, he intended to pursue this work because it was right and necessary. But he would be lying if he claimed that his vision for this better world did not center around the hope that she might consent to help build it alongside him, not as dependent or ornamental wife, but as true partner in every sense of that word. The letter ended simply. He would await her answer at Lyndhurst House, approximately 4 hours' ride from Willowmere. He would not press her for response if she chose to refuse, but he hoped she might grant him the opportunity to make his case in person rather than through inadequate written words. The choice, as always, was entirely hers to make. Cordelia sat in her medicinal garden, surrounded by chamomile and lavender that blurred through sudden tears, and felt the careful structure she had built around her disappointment crack completely apart. This was not the attention of a man seeking convenient partnership or fleeting fascination. This was regard manifested through understanding of what she valued most. Not romantic gestures, but systematic effort to change unjust structures. Not personal elevation, but recognition of work's genuine worth. Not promises easily made, but plans carefully executed. He had spent 3 weeks documenting her achievements when he might have spent that time courting appropriate young ladies from among the marriage mart's offerings. He had risked political capital and social censure to elevate her work when discretion would have been easier. He had offered her not merely his name and title, but the one thing she had believed impossible: true partnership between intellectual equals, founded on mutual respect and shared values rather than social calculation or economic necessity. The question was whether she possessed sufficient courage to accept what was offered. Her previous marriage had taught her caution, had demonstrated that men's pretty words during courtship might mask very different realities after vows were spoken. She was old enough to recognize that passion faded, that physical attraction dimmed, that the everyday reality of marriage tested far more than romantic fancy. In 10 years, Adrian would be 7 and 30, still young and vital. She would be 8 and 40, definitively middle-aged, marked by time in ways he had yet to experience. 2 voices warred within her, one forged in ice, one kindled in unexpected warmth. The voice of caution, born in those 2 days of glacial silence from Thaddeus, whispered its familiar warnings. These are merely prettier words, more elaborate promises designed to secure what he wants. Men speak of partnership during courtship and demand obedience after vows. You have been deceived before by attention that proved performance rather than genuine regard. Protect yourself. Refuse. But the voice of hope, tentatively awakened during weeks of genuine collaboration, offered different evidence. He did not offer words. He created legal documents. He did not promise a pedestal. He established a position with salary and authority. He did not speak of protecting you. He worked to change the structures that restrict you. He spent 3 weeks documenting your achievements when he might have spent that time courting appropriate young ladies. He is not hiding what he wants. He is risking his own social standing to validate work society dismisses. The battle between these voices was not brief or easy. Cordelia rose from her seat and paced the garden paths, weighing evidence with the same methodical attention she brought to agricultural decisions. Adrian's actions did not follow the pattern of her first marriage. Thaddeus had spoken eloquently of partnership, but never once asked her opinion on matters of substance after their wedding. Adrian had spent months actively seeking her guidance, implementing her recommendations, crediting her innovations publicly. But then, had she not learned that the things society valued, youth, beauty, fashionable accomplishment, were ultimately superficial compared to qualities of character and mind? Had she not discovered that true satisfaction came from meaningful work shared with respectful partners rather than from social position or romantic performance? Had she not concluded that authentic partnership between equals was vanishingly rare and therefore precious beyond measure when genuinely offered? The greater risk, she realized, was not in accepting what he offered, but in refusing it out of fear. She had lived half her life already in safety and caution, protecting herself from further disappointment by expecting nothing beyond what she could create for herself. In doing so, had she not also closed herself off from possibilities that required vulnerability to grasp, from partnerships that required trust to build, from love that required courage to accept? Cordelia rose from her seat among the herbs, her decision crystallizing with the same sudden clarity that came when a complex agricultural problem finally revealed its solution. She would ride to Lyndhurst House not to accept a proposal out of gratitude or desperation, but to determine whether the promise suggested by his letter could survive the test of direct conversation. She would ask the questions that needed asking: whether he truly understood what their marriage would mean, what they would face from society, what challenges they would encounter, whether he was prepared to partner with a woman who had learned to be difficult, who would not settle for less than genuine equality, who would challenge him and push him, and occasionally infuriate him with her stubborn insistence on doing what was right rather than what was convenient. And if, after such honest conversation, he still desired to proceed, well then. Cordelia Fairfax had survived disappointment before. Perhaps she possessed sufficient strength to risk hope once more. She went to find Edmund to borrow his fastest horse and inform him that she would be gone for the day on a matter of considerable importance. Her brother, who had watched her transformation from crushed young bride to capable widow with quiet satisfaction, simply nodded and ordered the mount prepared. He possessed, as always, the wisdom to refrain from unwanted questions or unnecessary advice. Some decisions, his expression suggested, belonged entirely to the individual making them. Adrian had spent the morning attempting to work on estate correspondence and agricultural reports, accomplishing nothing beyond staring at papers without comprehending their content. The 3 weeks since he had sent his letter to Cordelia had passed with excruciating slowness, each day bringing either hope that she might respond or despair that silence indicated rejection. He had argued with himself repeatedly about whether he should have been more direct, more romantic, more conventional in his approach. Perhaps women, even unconventional women like Cordelia, desired flowery declarations and passionate avowals rather than practical demonstrations and systematic plans for social reform. When his butler announced that Mrs. Fairfax had arrived and awaited him in the library, Adrian experienced a moment of pure terror. She had come, which suggested she had not dismissed his proposal outright. But she had chosen the library rather than a more formal receiving room, which suggested this would be a serious conversation rather than a simple acceptance. Very well. He had always known that a woman of Cordelia's intelligence would not accept any proposal without thorough examination of its implications and terms. He found her standing by the windows overlooking the estate's park, her traveling clothes dust-marked from the ride, her bearing as self-possessed as always, but her expression more unguarded than he had ever seen it. She turned when he entered, and the directness of her gaze, assessing, questioning, but not entirely closed, gave him reason for cautious hope. She spoke without preamble, in the forthright manner he had come to recognize as characteristic. She had read his letter, examined the legal documents, and appreciated the considerable thought and effort behind both. But she had questions that required answers before she could consider his proposal seriously, and she needed absolute honesty from him because she would not survive another marriage built on comfortable illusions that shattered upon contact with reality. Adrian assured her that he valued nothing more than honesty, and that he would answer any questions she posed with complete candor, even if those answers might damage his suit. She nodded, accepting this promise, and proceeded to systematically dismantle any romantic fantasy about their potential union. Did he understand that in 10 years, when he was still young and vigorous, she would be approaching 50? That society would view their pairing not as romantic, but as vaguely ridiculous, assuming either that she had trapped him or that he had married her out of misguided chivalry, that she could likely not provide him with children, and that his title would therefore pass to cousins or distant relatives rather than direct heirs. That her previous marriage had left scars, had taught her to be suspicious of male authority, had made her difficult and unbending on matters of principle. That she would not, under any circumstances, be an ornamental wife focused on social success. That she would continue her agricultural work and expect to be treated as full partner in estate management. That she would voice disagreement when she thought him wrong, would challenge decisions she considered unwise, would insist on being heard rather than decorously silent. That marriage to her would require constant negotiation, perpetual adjustment, and considerably more effort than marriage to some agreeable young lady who had been trained to defer and please? Adrian listened to this thorough catalogue of obstacles and difficulties with growing appreciation for the woman delivering it. Here was Cordelia, at her most formidable, refusing to be swayed by sentiment, insisting on clear-eyed assessment of reality, determined to protect both of them from the disappointment that came from insufficient preparation. She was not trying to discourage his suit so much as ensuring he understood exactly what he was proposing to undertake. It was, he recognized, an act of considerable courage and integrity. When she finished, he took a moment to gather his thoughts, wanting to respond with the same honesty she had offered. He acknowledged every concern she had raised as legitimate. Yes, their age difference would invite criticism. Yes, society would be unkind. Yes, the lack of direct heirs would disappoint some family members who had hoped for dynastic continuation. And yes, marriage to her would require considerably more effort and adjustment than marriage to someone more conventional. But then, he had not fallen in love with convention or simplicity. He had fallen in love with a woman whose intelligence challenged him, whose competence inspired him, whose integrity commanded his deepest respect. He had been raised to fulfill his duties as Earl, and those duties did include eventually producing heirs. But they also included managing his estates responsibly, treating his tenants justly, and using his position to effect positive change. He could accomplish those duties far better with her as partner than with any conventional young bride. Moreover, he was not so naive as to believe that conventional marriage to an appropriate young lady would automatically produce heirs. Plenty of aristocratic marriages remained childless despite the youth and presumed fertility of the bride. If they were blessed with children, he would welcome them. If they were not, he would ensure his title passed to relatives who could be trained to continue the progressive management they would establish together. Either way, the marriage itself held value beyond reproductive capacity. As for her concerns about being difficult and challenging, did she truly believe he would prefer a wife who agreed with everything he suggested, who never questioned his decisions, who treated his opinions as unassailable merely because he held a title? He had enough sycophants and yes-men among his social circle. What he needed, what he craved, was someone who would tell him when he was wrong, who would push him to think more deeply, who would hold him to higher standards than he might maintain alone. Her previous marriage had been to a man who wanted an ornament and resented her mind. His proposal was to a woman whose mind he valued above all her other qualities, whose partnership he desired precisely because she would be his equal rather than his subordinate. The fact that she would voice disagreement, would challenge him, would insist on being heard. These were not flaws to be overcome, but rather the very qualities that made her irreplaceable. He paused, then added one final observation. She had asked whether he understood what their marriage would cost them socially. He did. But had she considered what refusing his offer would cost them both? They had discovered something vanishingly rare: genuine intellectual compatibility, shared values, mutual respect that could form the foundation for true partnership. To reject that because of society's prejudices or fear of future disappointment would be, in its way, as tragic as the waste of her previous marriage. They would both live, certainly. They would both continue their work and find satisfaction in their accomplishments. But they would do so knowing they had chosen safety over possibility, caution over courage, and they would always wonder what might have been possible had they possessed sufficient faith in each other to try. The choice, he concluded, was ultimately hers to make. But whatever she decided, he wanted her to know that his regard was neither temporary fascination nor misguided chivalry. He loved her, not some idealized version of who she might be, but the actual woman standing before him, complete with scars and difficulties and stubborn determination to do what was right. And that love would not diminish if she refused him, though he rather hoped she might find sufficient courage to accept instead. Cordelia stood silent for a long moment, her expression betraying the internal struggle between hard-won caution and dangerous hope. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but her words cost her visible effort. She confessed that she was terrified, not of society's censure or the difference in their ages, but of something far more personal and devastating: that one day he would wake up and realize he had wasted his youth on a woman whose best years were behind her, that he would come to resent the choices he had made, that she would find herself once again in a marriage where she was tolerated rather than truly desired. Adrian closed the distance between them, not touching, but near enough that she could see his expression clearly, could assess the truth of his words through direct observation. He told her, with absolute conviction, that the choice he was making was not waste, but investment, that her best years were not behind her, but still to come, because the work they could accomplish together would eclipse anything either could achieve alone, that he might occasionally be frustrated with her, as she would doubtless be frustrated with him. But frustration was different from resentment, was the natural result of two strong-minded people building something meaningful together, rather than the resentment that came from one person suffocating the other's capabilities. He asked her to look at the documents he had prepared, the evidence he had compiled, the plans he had laid out. Did those look like the actions of a man acting from chivalry or temporary fascination? He had invested considerable time, effort, and political capital not into romantic gestures, but into creating the structural changes that would allow her to be fully herself within their marriage. He was not asking her to diminish herself to fit into his life. He was attempting to expand both their lives to accommodate everything they might build together. Finally, he made an observation that seemed to strike at the heart of her resistance. She had survived enormous disappointment in her previous marriage by learning to expect nothing, to protect herself through emotional distance, to find satisfaction in work rather than relationships. Those strategies had been necessary and appropriate for surviving that particular situation. But did she truly want to spend the rest of her life employing defensive strategies designed for past battles rather than current possibilities? At some point, survival had to give way to living, caution to risk, protection to vulnerability. He was asking her to take that risk with him, offering every assurance and evidence he could provide that the risk was warranted. But ultimately, the decision was hers alone to make. Cordelia turned back to the window, her gaze distant, but her mind clearly engaged in fierce internal debate. Adrian waited, forcing himself to remain silent, to allow her the space to think without pressure or persuasion beyond what he had already offered. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the ticking of the library's clock and the distant sounds of estate activity beyond the windows. When she turned back to him, her expression had shifted from fearful resistance to something closer to cautious determination. She would, she told him, agree to his proposal, but with conditions. They would have a reasonably long engagement, not to satisfy society, but to determine whether their compatibility survived the pressures and expectations that would come with publicly announced intentions. During this period, she would work with him as the appointed manager of his estates as the legal documents specified, testing whether their professional partnership could withstand the inevitable disagreements and difficulties of actual collaboration. If, at the end of this trial period, they both still wished to proceed, they would marry with the clear understanding that theirs would not be a conventional aristocratic union, but rather a working partnership between equals. Moreover, she required absolute honesty from him. If he ever came to regret his choice, if he ever wished he had married someone younger or more conventional, if he ever resented the social consequences of their pairing, she needed him to voice those feelings rather than swallowing them in misguided protection of her feelings. She had lived through one marriage built on polite pretense and suffocating silence, and she would not survive another. She would rather face difficult truths than comfortable lies. Adrian agreed to all conditions immediately, recognizing them as reasonable given her previous experiences and the unusual nature of their situation. He suggested they announce their understanding privately to her brother and his closest family members first, before making any public declaration. This would allow time for adjustment, for managing initial reactions, and for ensuring their choice was communicated as deliberate partnership rather than scandalous impulse. Then, because the moment seemed to demand something beyond practical negotiation, he took her hand, the first time he had touched her beyond the formal contact of dancing. Her hand was warm and capable, marked by garden work and estate management, and it felt exactly right in his grasp. He told her simply that he would do everything in his power to ensure she never regretted trusting him with her vulnerability, with her hope, with the precious gift of second chances. Cordelia, whose eyes had remained dry through all the practical discussion, felt tears threaten at this simple declaration. She had learned not to trust pretty words, had built careful defenses against romantic manipulation. But this was different. This was a man who demonstrated regard through action, who understood that trust must be earned through consistent behavior rather than demanded as automatic right, who seemed to genuinely comprehend that partnership required ongoing effort rather than assuming that marriage vows settled all questions permanently. She allowed herself, finally, to believe that perhaps this time might be different. That perhaps her capacity for hope had not been entirely destroyed by previous disappointment. That perhaps, at 38, with most of her life behind her and all her illusions stripped away, she had finally found something more valuable than illusions, genuine possibility founded on clear-eyed understanding rather than romantic fantasy. They spent the remainder of the afternoon in detailed discussion of estate management and agricultural reform, slipping easily into the intellectual partnership that had first drawn them together. But something had shifted, some barrier had fallen. When their hands brushed reaching for the same document, neither pulled away immediately. When their eyes met over some point of agricultural theory, the look held a moment longer than strictly necessary. When the afternoon light faded and Cordelia rose to return to Willowmere before darkness fell, Adrian walked her to her horse and assisted her into the saddle, his hands lingering a moment at her waist. He would call on her brother tomorrow, he promised, to formally request permission for the understanding between them. They would proceed slowly and carefully, building their future with the same methodical attention to detail they brought to estate management. But they would proceed together, partners in every sense of that word, building something neither could accomplish alone. As Cordelia rode back to Willowmere through the summer evening, she felt something she had not experienced in years: joy untainted by fear, hope untempered by cynicism, and the profound satisfaction of knowing that perhaps, just perhaps, she had found someone who saw her not as society saw her, but as she actually was, and loved what he saw completely. The engagement, When it was announced 3 months later, after a period of careful preparation and diplomatic family conversations, caused precisely the scandal Cordelia had anticipated. The Tun's drawing rooms hummed with speculation and censure. A young Earl of 27 marrying a widow of 38. A woman 11 years his senior, without fortune or remarkable beauty, past her childbearing years. Clearly she had trapped him somehow, perhaps through her position managing his estates, perhaps by playing on his inexperience and good nature. Or perhaps, this whispered with particular venom, there had been inappropriate relations before the engagement, and honor had demanded the marriage. The fact that the engagement period had been remarkably proper, conducted with impeccable attention to all social conventions, did nothing to quell such speculation. The fact that Lord Lyndhurst seemed entirely content with his choice showed no signs of coercion or regret, and spoke of his intended bride with respect and evident regard, merely confirmed to the gossips that the poor young man had been thoroughly deceived about what marriage to such a woman would entail. Cordelia, who had weathered social censure before, found she cared remarkably little what the Tun thought of her choices. She had secured something far more valuable than social approval, a partnership that challenged and fulfilled her, a companion who valued her capabilities, and the legal authority to continue the work that gave her life meaning. If society wished to pity Lord Lyndhurst for his supposedly poor choice, that said more about society's limitations than about her worth or his wisdom. Adrian, for his part, used the controversy productively. He wrote a detailed paper on agricultural innovation for the Royal Agricultural Society, prominently crediting Mrs. Fairfax's methods and documenting their superior results. When fellow members of the Lords made condescending comments about his upcoming marriage, he responded with detailed explanations of how his intended bride's agricultural innovations had increased his estate revenues by 40% while simultaneously improving tenant welfare. When older peers suggested he was making a mistake marrying someone past her bloom, he pleasantly noted that youth was a temporary condition while intelligence and competence were permanent qualities, and he preferred a foundation that would last. His mother, the Dowager Countess, proved surprisingly supportive once she recovered from her initial shock. A practical woman herself, constrained by social convention into primarily decorative roles, she recognized in Cordelia a kindred spirit who had found ways to exercise genuine capability despite society's restrictions. After a single conversation with her future daughter-in-law about estate management and tenant welfare, she became Cordelia's firm ally, hosting a series of gatherings specifically designed to introduce the future Countess to influential women who might appreciate unconventional excellence. Edmund Fairfax, when approached by Adrian for permission to marry his sister, had simply observed that Cordelia had survived one disastrous marriage arranged by others and had earned the right to make her own choices about any subsequent unions. If she had chosen Lord Lyndhurst, he trusted her judgment far more than he trusted society's conventions. Moreover, having watched the Earl's careful courtship over the preceding months, Edmund had concluded that the young man genuinely understood what he was gaining and what he would face. He gave his blessing with sincere goodwill and the suggestion that perhaps they might co-author a treatise on progressive estate management that could benefit others attempting similar innovations. Young Arabella, somewhat to Cordelia's surprise, seemed more excited than disappointed by the engagement. She had observed her aunt's transformation during Adrian's courtship, had witnessed Cordelia's gradual emergence from resignation into renewed vitality, and had learned more from watching that progression than from a dozen lectures on marriage. She confided to Cordelia that she had initially been terrified of the London season and the pressure to secure an advantageous match, but watching her aunt find love based on shared interests and mutual respect had shown her a different possibility. Perhaps, Arabella suggested, there were men who might value her thoughts as much as her fortune, who might prefer genuine conversation to practiced accomplishments. She would seek such a man herself, even if it meant disappointing mothers who expected her to pursue titles and wealth rather than compatibility and respect. The wedding, when it occurred in early October, was a deliberately modest affair. They married in the village church near Willowmere, with only family and close friends in attendance. Cordelia wore not virginal white, but a deep autumn gold that complemented her coloring and acknowledged her status as widow rather than maiden. No pretense of youthful innocence, no attempt to obscure the reality of their situations. They exchanged vows with complete understanding of what they promised: partnership, respect, fidelity not merely of body but of purpose and principle. The wedding breakfast took place at Willowmere, in the gardens Cordelia had cultivated and tended. Under October's golden light, surrounded by late-blooming roses and the harvest bounty of her medicinal herbs, she stood beside her new husband and felt something she had never experienced during her first marriage: certainty. Not naive, romantic certainty that love would solve all difficulties, but mature recognition that she had chosen well. That partnership with this particular man offered genuine possibility for lasting satisfaction. That the work they would do together mattered more than society's sneering dismissal of their union. Adrian, watching his bride move among the guests with quiet confidence, felt profound gratitude for his own younger self's wisdom in recognizing that conventional choices would have been catastrophic mistakes. Yes, Cordelia was older than him. Yes, society disapproved. Yes, they would face continued censure and speculation. And yes, everything he had gained was worth 10 times what he had sacrificed in social standing and conventional respectability. The first year of their marriage proved, as Cordelia had predicted, to require considerable adjustment and effort. Merging their approaches to estate management, negotiating decisions about which innovations to implement when and where, managing disagreements about priorities and methods, all of this took time, patience, and willingness to compromise from both parties. Adrian learned that his wife's stubbornness, which had seemed admirable in theory, could be intensely frustrating in practice when she refused to concede on matters she considered important. Cordelia discovered that her husband's enthusiasm for immediate sweeping change sometimes overwhelmed his assessment of practical constraints. But they learned to navigate these differences through the foundation of respect they had established. When they disagreed, they argued, loudly sometimes, but always returned to shared principles and mutual commitment to finding solutions that honored both perspectives. When one made a mistake, the other provided support rather than condemnation, understanding that innovation required accepting some failures along the path to success. And when they succeeded, they shared the satisfaction equally, neither claiming credit at the other's expense. The agricultural reforms they implemented together across Adrian's estates became models studied by other progressive landowners. The system of tenant support Cordelia designed, combining fair rents with investment in improvements, balancing profit with welfare, creating pathways for capable tenants to eventually acquire their own freeholds, demonstrated that enlightened management could be both morally right and economically sound. The medicinal gardens she established on each property provided practical health care for workers, while also generating modest income through sales to apothecaries and hospitals. Adrian's work with the parliamentary reform committees, meanwhile, began slowly dismantling the legal barriers preventing women from holding positions of authority. He could not change everything overnight. Centuries of precedent and prejudice proved remarkably resistant to reform. But he could create openings, establish precedents, and demonstrate through Cordelia's example that capability should supersede gender in determining fitness for responsibility. 2 years into their marriage, during a parliamentary session where Adrian was presenting evidence for expanded agricultural education, including opportunities for women, Cordelia sat in the ladies' gallery, watching her husband advocate passionately for changes that would benefit thousands of women denied opportunities to exercise their full capabilities. She was, as careful observers noted with interest, noticeably with child. The physician's words, delivered 3 weeks prior, had been received not with the immediate joy one might expect, but with stunned silence. They had ridden home from his consulting rooms without speaking, each lost in thoughts too tangled to voice. At 41 years, Cordelia had long since made peace with childlessness, had built an identity around other forms of creation and legacy. The possibility of motherhood now felt like a door opening in a wall she had believed solid, disorienting, terrifying, and impossibly precious all at once. That evening, they had not spoken of heirs or dynastic succession. They had simply held each other, sharing fear alongside wonder. Adrian confessed he had not dared hope for this gift, knowing her previous childless marriage and the risks at her age. Cordelia admitted her terror, not of childbirth itself, though that danger was real, but of the vulnerability this brought. She had survived by needing nothing she could not provide herself. Now she would need him in ways she had carefully avoided needing anyone since Thaddeus's death. The pregnancy itself, arriving naturally when she had finally stopped yearning for it, struck them both as remarkably fitting, though neither would voice such sentiments publicly. When their daughter was born that autumn, a healthy girl they named Eleanor after Cordelia's mother, the event occasioned fresh rounds of gossip. The Tun's matrons observed that Lord Lyndhurst now had an heir, or would have if the child had been male. Some suggested he might set aside his aging wife in hopes of producing a son with someone younger and more fertile. Others predicted the marriage would now deteriorate since its presumed purpose had been achieved. These predictions proved as short-sighted as all previous assumptions about the union. Adrian, far from viewing the child as justification for reducing his regard for Cordelia, seemed if anything more devoted. He had witnessed firsthand the risks and difficulties of childbirth at her age, had spent days of worry while she labored, and had emerged from the experience with renewed appreciation for what she had risked to give him this unexpected gift of fatherhood. More importantly, Eleanor's arrival did not diminish their working partnership. They had employed capable nursery staff precisely so that Cordelia could continue her estate management and agricultural advocacy. She nursed the child herself when possible, scandalizing proper ladies who considered such tasks beneath aristocratic dignity. But she also returned to her fields and her ledgers within weeks of the birth, because motherhood was an addition to her identity rather than a replacement for everything she had built. 3 years after Eleanor's birth, as Cordelia approached her 44th year, the legislation Adrian had championed finally passed through Parliament. The Property and Management Reform Act, while modest in scope and limited in implementation, established legal precedent that women could hold positions of authority in estate management, could inherit and control property in their own right under certain circumstances, and could not be automatically dismissed from positions of responsibility solely due to gender. The act would help only a small number of women initially, but it represented the first crack in centuries of legal restriction, and future reformers would widen that crack into genuine change. When news of the Act's passage reached Lyndhurst House, Adrian found Cordelia in her office, reviewing crop reports and making notations for the spring planting season. He told her what had been accomplished, how her work and their partnership had helped create this change, how women decades hence would have opportunities that seemed impossible today because of what they had built together. Cordelia set down her pen and regarded her husband with the clear-eyed assessment that had first attracted his attention years before. She observed that the act was imperfect, that the changes would be slow, that they had accomplished far less than what needed doing. But then she continued with a slight smile. Perfection was an illusory goal. What mattered was direction, moving toward justice rather than away from it, expanding possibility rather than accepting constraint, building something lasting rather than settling for temporary comfort. She rose from her desk and crossed to where he stood, taking his hands in hers, with the easy familiarity of partners who had weathered disagreements and disappointments and emerged with regard intact. She told him that when she had first met him, she had been certain her life's meaningful work was finished, that she would spend her remaining years comfortably but without particular purpose beyond continuing what she had already established. He had challenged that certainty, had shown her that second chances existed for those brave enough to grasp them, had demonstrated that partnership between equals could accomplish more than either could achieve alone. Their story, she suggested, might serve as useful reminder that worth was not measured by years or youth, that love required courage to risk after disappointment, that the best partnerships were those that expanded both persons rather than requiring either to diminish themselves. Society would continue dismissing women past their bloom, would continue assuming that only youth and conventional beauty held value. But they had proven otherwise, had built something substantial and lasting, and perhaps their example might encourage others to question assumptions rather than accepting them as truth. Adrian drew her close, kissing her with the comfortable affection of spouses who had navigated 5 years of marriage with its inevitable difficulties and enduring satisfactions. He told her that he had never regretted choosing partnership with her over conventional marriage with some appropriate young lady, had never wished he had made different choices, had never felt he had wasted anything, but rather had gained everything that mattered. He loved her not despite her years, but because of what those years had taught her, not despite her unconventionality, but because of how that unconventionality had challenged him to question his own assumptions. Not despite her difficulties, but because those difficulties ensured their partnership remained dynamic rather than stagnant. As evening fell over the estate they managed together, over the fields whose yields had doubled under Cordelia's innovations, over the tenant cottages where families thrived under enlightened management, over the gardens where medicinal herbs grew alongside roses, the Earl and Countess of Lyndhurst stood together reviewing plans for the coming season. They would plant new crops, would implement further innovations, would continue advocating for reforms that would help others as they had helped each other. Their daughter Eleanor, being raised to believe that women's capabilities should determine their opportunities rather than their gender restricting their choices, played in the garden under her nursemaid's watchful eye. She would grow up seeing her mother treated as true partner in her parents' work, would absorb lessons about worth and capability that society still resisted teaching, would perhaps one day benefit from the legal changes her parents had fought to establish. As the afternoon light slanted golden through the office windows, Adrian entered to find Cordelia bent over the large estate map spread across the desk, making notations for the spring planting season. 3 years of marriage had not diminished the quiet satisfaction he felt watching her work. The competent movements of her hand, the slight furrow of concentration between her brows, the way she unconsciously tapped the pen against her lower lip when considering a particularly complex decision. He moved to stand behind her, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. She covered it with her own without looking up, a gesture so natural and familiar it required no thought. Together they studied the map, fields marked for rotation, new irrigation channels planned, tenant cottages scheduled for improvements, the work of their partnership made visible in ink and careful notation. "The south field?" he asked quietly, noting her hesitation over one particular section. "Still deciding," she murmured. "The soil has recovered well, but another season of rest might be wiser than rushing the planting." She glanced up at him then, and something in her expression, contentment mixed with purpose, satisfaction tinged with challenge, reminded him why he had chosen this path. Not despite the difficulties, but because of what they could build together. "We have time to decide," he said, squeezing her shoulder gently. Through the window, they could hear Eleanor's delighted laughter as she discovered something fascinating in the herb garden, some small growing thing full of possibility. Cordelia smiled, returning her attention to the map, and Adrian remained beside her, his hand still resting on her shoulder. There were no grand declarations needed, no romantic pronouncements. Just this, two people who had found each other against all probability, building something that mattered, one careful decision at a time. The work would continue, the seasons would turn, and they would face it all together, as partners, as equals, as two people who had dared to believe that love might look different than society prescribed, and had discovered something far more valuable than conventional happiness. They had discovered truth.